Welcome to the Recovery Toolkit Podcast. I'm Richie. I'm going to be your host. Throughout the series, we're going to talk to a range of different people who will give you tools and tips to help manage your recovery. The podcast itself is being brought to you by Epic Restart Foundation, who are a national charity who support people to rebuild a positive life after gambling. So welcome back to the Recovery Toolkit Podcast. This week, I'm joined by Professor David Best. Very excited to have a conversation, David. I know a little bit about you, but not a lot. So I would love to delve into who you are, why you do what you do, and then see if we can get into a bit of recovery stuff, really.
Perfect.
So first of all, thanks for joining us, because I know you've got a very busy schedule and you've squeezed this in, but I really appreciate that. So Professor David Best, there's a bit of clue in the title. Tell us a bit about yourself and kind of what it is that you do.
Yep. So, look, let me start at the beginning. Why am I involved in this area of work? Well, my father was an alcoholic. I was brought up in an alcoholic household. When I started doing my PhD, I got the opportunity to work with a now largely forgotten addiction academic called John Davis, who was my PhD supervisor, who wrote a wonderful book called The Myth of Addiction that was about addiction as a social construct. And don't worry, I'm not going to go through step by step, year by year of my entire career, because I'm very old and that takes a very long time. And I basically, really my career splits into two parts. The first part was really as a clinical addiction academic. So I did my training at the South London and Maudsley NHS Trust. And I was there as a psychologist, research coordinator. So I got an awful lot of hands-on experience of working in a heroin detox ward, an alcohol detox ward, a methadone maintenance clinic, and something I'm sure we'll come on to, is that there was almost no gambling treatment at all. I mean, this place called itself the National Addiction Centre. It was massively funded. We didn't do gambling at all. We did bits of tobacco, but it was all alcohol and illicit drugs, basically. And then two things happened to me in, I guess, 2008, 2009. One, there was an American academic called William White came over talking about the American recovery movement. And it was like nothing I'd heard about before. And within a couple of months, I was invited, purely by chance, to preside at a 12-step graduation program in Lancaster Farms Prison. And I went up and I observed the sheer intensity of collective feeling, pride, belonging. And having worked in treatment clinical services for a decade, I've never seen anything like it. Our group work was miserable and painful and dull. And there were mothers there in tears visiting the prison, and there were, folk were hugging each other. And it was genuinely a really intense emotional experience. And since that time, my work is almost exclusively focused on recovery. So as an academic, I've probably collected just over 4,000 recovery stories. Scotland, England, Wales, Canada, America, New Zealand, and Australia. And in that time, I really have built up a considerable network of connections with people who are involved in the recovery movement in one way or another. I'm now a professor of addiction recovery, so I have a centre that focuses exclusively on recovery. And I work part of the time here, part of the time in America, where I also have a wife and, to my considerable surprise, a 2-year-old daughter. And I work some of the time in Australia as well. So I kind of have an international profile of work. But really, some of it's prison-based now. So I do quite a bit of stuff in prisons. I do bits of stuff in the Ministry of Justice. But in essence, what really my career has been about, and hopefully we'll come on to this, is defining a concept called recovery capital, and then how do you go about counting and measuring it.
Yeah. And today you're working in Newcastle.
What?
All them wonderful places, northeast of England.
Yeah, today Newcastle, tomorrow Middlesbrough. Yeah. It doesn't get more glamorous than that.
What I love about that is that concept of like recovery in the prison, like got you into it, was like, oh, this is different.
Totally.
And I think that for me, anything that sums up us up at Epic Restart Foundation's hope and inspiration. And to a struggling addict, gambling addict, heroin, whatever drugs, drink, that hope and inspiration, seeing somebody that's managed to get through it, that's the life-changing bit. Because once you see that, you've got an opportunity that there's another way.
Now, the reason I was in Newcastle today and yesterday was we were doing community connector training about how you make recovery visible, accessible and attractive. But today, Newcastle became a Marmot city, which is like a big public health thing. And the guy behind this, Sir Michael Marmot, really talked a lot about hope today, about that sense of hope for Newcastle. And it was interesting. I gave some data and statistics at the conference about recovery. And afterwards, a woman came up to me and said, my boyfriend's in the QE at the moment, which is a local hospital that does alcohol detox. And she was saying, I was so pleased to hear what you had to say because it gave me that sense of hope and belief that change is possible, because it's so important. Two, if you don't mind me indulge with two quick anecdotes. When I set up the Recovery Academy in 2010 or 2011, I set it up with a guy called Stephen Bamber. And Stephen Bamber, who was from Manchester, used to tell this story about saying, I'd been in a methadone clinic for 8 years before I discovered that there was such a thing as recovery. I just thought I was, I mean, in case you're not always swearing on the pod, I was screwed.
So hell you won.
Fine. So his phrase was, I was fucked. I thought that was me for the rest of my life. And it was a real revelation to me. So there's something crucially important about that sense of recovery as something that has to be visible. And the other thing that, I don't know if it's a phrase you're familiar with, but from the mental health recovery movement, and I think it applies in the addictions field, I'm sure it applies to gambling, we have an acronym called CHIME. And CHIME is basically like the summary of evidence about what makes a recovery project effective. And it's essentially connection, hope, identity, meaning, and empowerment. And the idea is, and it would certainly be true for my work, is like recovery basically starts with some kind of genuine, meaningful connection, ideally to a peer, that generates the belief that if you can do it, I can do it. And that hope is what mobilizes people to do stuff, not to sit there mired in self-pity and learned helplessness about my life's a mess, I was born that way, it's in my genes, it's trauma, whatever. And gets people to say, no, I can do this. I can make something of myself. And of the 4,000 recovery stories I've collected, Richie, the only thing they all have in common is nobody does it alone. Always it requires other people. It's a social process of change. Now, an interesting question, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, is how much can we translate from drug and alcohol to gambling? Because there's a real temptation. And for drug and alcohol, it's always the same with mental health. This is what works in mental health. Let's just uncritically translate it to drug and alcohol. And I know from people I know who do work in gambling that say, you can take some of it, but you have to look through a different lens.
What is the difference then, David, in your experience? I think, because I always, when I got into this space 4 years ago, it was through passion. It was through me wanting to help a Richie who's further behind us. You know, that was what it was all about. It was about trying to give back and trying to support people. And then I'm one of these geeks who just loves research, loves reading, loves personal development. And I went on this journey of like trying to understand addiction, trying to understand the drugs and alcohol. And the gambling's probably, at that time, was probably about 20 years behind. They're catching up much quicker because they're learning a little bit. I still think there's a lot to learn from the drug and alcohol. But what's the difference, and what's the things that we should be looking to learn from the drugs and alcohol space, and what things do we potentially need to explore ourselves? Yeah.
So let me first say, I would not claim to be an expert in gambling recovery. Yeah. And partly I would say that's because I don't think there are many experts in gambling recovery. I think that work has still to be done. And recovery is localised in a way that addiction science isn't. So we can't say, because this works for white, middle-aged, working-class men, which is what the majority of the drug and alcohol recovery literature comes from, it would work for Asian women or for Maori men, whatever. So you've got to be really careful about generalisability anyway with the recovery literature, because it's situated, so it depends on networks and contacts and context. I think gambling is fundamentally different as a science because the etiology of it is different. You know, if you look at the majority of people who end up with drug and alcohol addiction, you can look at a whole range of clear risk factors and absence of protective factors. So you can almost like over-predict people on the basis of parental substance use, maternal use during pregnancy, difficulty early childhood, traumatic life events, poor socialization, poor engagement with school, deviant or delinquent friends, early onset of sex risk behaviour, criminal behaviour, early onset of drug and alcohol. So you've got this massive kind of, and obviously it's not a universal rule, we can all name exceptions to it. But with gambling, the bits that I have done, and I've done various bits with Beacon Council and Trust in particular, the etiology appears to be much, much more unpredictable. The onset, when it starts, the time to problem onset much faster. You know, so the general assumption about drug and alcohol career is people start experimenting at 10 or 11 or 12. They first get into trouble, significant trouble around 18, 19, 20. They'll then have 5 years or so of trying to stop themselves. They'll then have 8 years in and out of treatment services, 4 to 5 episodes of care, and then a 5-year journey of recovery with typically a few blips along the way. I don't know how much of any of those things we could translate to gambling. It's a good working model to start from, because I think some of the things I think we can translate is the notion of we can use recovery capital as a measurement or a metric to say, well, we can count what the barriers, the unmet needs, and the personal, social, and community resources people can tap into. And in my limited experience of this, so why do people recover? Well, it's a social contagion. The primary mechanism is not therapist to client, it's peer-to-peer. You know, one of the challenges that we have for switching to a recovery model is it kind of abandons the notion that people get better by sitting across a desk, flapping your gums at somebody and, you know, using CBT or MET, and you think, well, I'm not sure we've learned that lesson in the drug and alcohol field. We certainly haven't in the gambling field, and I am really. I
don't know if you're familiar with the NICE guidelines that have just come out.
I am
with around gambling, and that's predominantly what it's talking about, isn't it? CBT is the only thing that we have evidence for that works, and how wrong is the path that we're taking people down if that's the belief system?
Totally. And, you know, in my experience of working in treatment services, that very narrow, professionalised model is so fundamentally flawed that the idea that you translate that to anything else, that, you know, you wouldn't think of from the mental health field something much more like assertive community treatment. I loved the model that was being espoused today, which is how do you build communities that create the conditions that allow people to live better lives? You know, the notion that you're going to therapize people into getting better is so limited and so very, almost as, it seems to me, and I don't wish to mock the current practice, it seems to me almost as much wishful thinking as the idea that naltrexone will make things better for people with gambling problems. You know, that you can somehow medicate your way out of gambling problems just strikes me as incredibly optimistic wishful thinking.
Yeah, it seems like they want to fix the person and then they'll be all right to go on their way.
And we know that recovery isn't about fixing people. Yeah. It's about, and I've got a PhD student at the moment who's looking at older onset drinking, and really it's about how do people develop a sense of purpose and meaning in life once their kids have left home, when they retire. It's not about, they don't need therapy, they don't need treatment in that traditional sense. What they need is a sense of life purpose and meaning, and that sense of being valuable and useful and helping other people is so fundamental to the recovery process.
Yeah, I think there's a narrative being driven around that. Obviously, there's also a big levy coming into the space, and I think all of that is political
Totally.
driven rather than actually person-centered driven. And it's a bit sad, but there is people out there trying to do it different. We'll see how far we get in the new system and the new landscape. But
this does seem to be like a mistake we made in the drug and alcohol field. Really, probably post HIV, when we started saying tertiary care should be the first point of call. You know, what do we want? We want, as soon as somebody's flagged as having a problem, we want them in tertiary specialist medicalised care. Well, that seems to me fundamentally flawed. You know, the idea that you wouldn't have community-based projects that combine harm reduction, early intervention, prevention, targeted prevention as like a much more community-focused, not clinic-focused. Because one of the things I think the recovery literature has shown very clearly is people don't recover in clinics, they recover in communities, and they recover. And if it's done well and right, the benefit has a ripple effect out from individual to family to community.
Yeah, 100%. I think we often talk about the ripple effect of addiction, but actually the ripple effect of recovery can be tenfold.
Yeah.
And that's what I've seen with the people that we support. And, you know, we're currently in the process of setting up a new affected other friends and family service as well. So there's a much more holistic approach to, you know, a family unit getting the support that they potentially need as well. So it's all stuff in the making, but I think we're heading in the right direction. When you mention people recovering communities, tell us a little bit about what that means for you.
Yeah, look, for me, sadly, I've devoted now 15 years of my life to something that you can summarise in two phrases. Either way you go, you either say, what are the best predictors of recovery? Jobs, friends and houses, or somewhere to live, someone to love and something to do. You know, that's the summary. And it starts often by psychological safety. Have you got a place to live that is free from threat and free from significant challenge? From that, there's the sense of, do you have positive social networks? And here the drug and alcohol recovery literature is absolutely consistent. The biggest predictor, and I don't know how well this translates, it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on this. The single biggest predictor of addiction recovery from alcohol and drugs is transitioning from network supportive of your drinking or drug use to network supportive of your recovery. So, and particularly, I don't know if you know the 12-step literature, but you know that the primary mechanism of action of AA for men is around change social networks. For women, it's about increased alcohol abstinence, self-efficacy. But it seems to me that there's a big part of what we know about how people change is if you change the groups people belong to and they actively engage in those groups, it changes their social identity. In other words, how they see themselves in a social space, which means people develop new norms, values, and belief systems. Yeah. And they are fundamental to sustainable change. You know, that if you end up in a situation where you think, how am I supposed to socialise without drinking? Because there's nothing else that's fun or enjoyable or pleasurable. And I can imagine a similar model for gamblers that are saying, you know, all I want to do is get back to my phone or get back to the casino or whatever it is. And for me, this is a fundamental shift that's socially... The other thing for me that I increasingly try and describe to people is the switch from a treatment model to a recovery model, is the switch from an inside-out model to an outside-in model. So the assumption of traditional treatment, whether it's medical treatment or pharmacotherapy or psychological therapy, is you change things in people's heads and change things in people's bodies, as a result of which they're then able to change who they spend time with, as a result of which you can then engage with those broader community things like work. And whereas for me, a recovery model is an outside-in model. You start by saying, how do you mobilise resources in communities that afford people access to meaningful activities that gives their days shape and purpose, that also affords opportunities to make new social networks, you know, whether it's a Zumba class or a fishing club or indeed supporting Newcastle United. And then from that, you then develop a much more sophisticated set of new networks. Because I think and this is not meant to be me proselytising on behalf of the 12 steps, but one of the things that happens with people there is they start off going to the meetings, and the meetings is the centre, but pretty quickly it's about the coffee afterwards and the person who's taking you to this activity or that activity. It's nothing to do with the 12 steps.
Yeah, definitely. For me, 12 steps was the stepping stone, and I say all the time, for the first 18 months, I was in meeting every day. Like that was where I was, but that was safety. Yeah. That was the safety part, and I felt safe there. I now speak to somebody every day from 12-step recovery, and I don't really go to meetings anymore. But for me, just speaking to somebody else that's in 12-step recovery, that's the community I've developed. That's the support network I've got. So it is still 12-step because we still practice the 12 steps. We just don't go to the meetings.
Yeah.
And that's the development of recovery for me, where some people say, you should go to meetings every day. But I don't think that actually, if there's two people who are in recovery talking to each other, then it's a meeting.
Yeah. And look, one of the things, I did a book about 10 years ago about recovery, about professionals who work in the addictions field who were in recovery themselves. And by far the most typical pathway was intensive residential treatment for 3 to 6 months, followed by 1 to 3 years of involvement in 12-step, then move away and get on with your life.
Yeah.
And the argument is, in those early days of recovery, there's a lot of reasons why you want to completely surround yourself with other people in recovery. If 5 years later you still need to go to 90 meetings in 90 days, something has gone badly wrong, because you should at some point have grown out of that recovery bubble. And we talk about recovery in 3 stages. So early recovery is the first year. And in that first year, people are highly fragile and highly vulnerable. And the likelihood of relapse, typically after detox for alcohol and opiates, is 50 to 70%. If you make it to 5 years, the likelihood of relapse is about 14%. And you would say beyond that point, it's kind of self-sustaining. So the argument is you don't need other people typically. Yeah. Now, they're averages, so obviously it depends on your resources. But the argument would be it's a gradual process of transition. And for many people, that doesn't require treatment beforehand. That recovery journey can start with friendship, 12-step, SMART, what we now call LEROs, lived experience recovery organisations, some of which might just be about peer mentoring, some of it might be about going hill walking. That's fine, And I think one of the key things that we are now aware of is there are multiple pathways, and people will need different resources at different... It's not just that you and me might require different things in our journey. It's that you're going to require different things in year 1 that you're going to require in year 3, year 5, whatever. Yeah,
and I love, there's a few things you mentioned there. Multiple pathways to recovery is the thing that we are so passionate about at Epic. We have like a prehab program, and that prehab program is about raising somebody's understanding and awareness of multiple pathways, so that's not one size fits all. Sharing, what resources are out there, tools, tricks, tips to help them get through some of them really early days and harder days in the recovery space, and then holding the hand a little bit to the next step, wherever the next step is for them. But the most important thing is giving them the autonomy to choose what their next step is. And if it's informed decision because you've given them a bit of information and you've raised their awareness, then there's more likelihood that they're going to follow it through because they don't feel pushed into or pressured into.
And the other thing from my point of view is generally more is better. So we did I led a European study of recovery pathways in Scotland, England, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And what we found was, as at least one other study has previously reported, people who went to specialist treatment and 12-step did better than people who went to only one of them. Mm-hmm. In an Australian study I was involved in a number of years ago, and this shouldn't work. People who went to 12-step and SMART recovery did better than people who only went to 12-step and SMART recovery. And for me, this is a social cure. This is entirely about you increase your range of methods, techniques, capacities, but you also are engaging in different social networks, different groups with access to different kind of community opportunities. So, as academics, we should be inclined to say, but philosophically they're not compatible. Who cares if the people benefit from multiple engagement or meet different people and develop different ways of coping? Good, go for it.
Yeah,
you work out your way.
Definitely, and I think that's where our name for this podcast came from, the Recovery Toolkit. What's in your toolkit for your recovery? And the more things you can put in, the better chance you've got, as long as you know how to use some of them things, I think. Yeah. So, throw as many things at the wall and see what sticks for you is kind of what we always encourage people.
And that's really where the concept of recovery capital came from. It was that idea of how do you build up a resource bank? Toolkit's a great alternative name for it, of like, and the big switch was to say, was not just things that you possess, even abstract things like self-esteem or coping skills. It's who are the people you can tap into and draw on. Where are you going to go to fill your days with work? Have you got access to a library? Is your working environment toxic? Have you a house that's safe? So there's that sense of there is you and all the skills you have, your qualifications, your driving license, all that kind of practical stuff. Then there's but who are the people you can rely on that you could sleep on their floor, or that they'll take you somewhere, or that if you phone them at 3 o'clock in the morning, they're not going to shout at you. They are resources, and effectively you have your tools, but you also have the mechanisms of tapping into a whole range of other toolkits.
Yeah, definitely. The other thing you mentioned that I want to pick up on, you mentioned Lero. Tell us a bit about what a Lero is for people that might not know, and then what is their part in recovery.
Yeah, so right at the start of COVID, there's been a number of local community recovery organisations. Now, in the UK, they're nowhere near as well developed as they are in the United States, where there are hundreds of them. And basically, they typically are physical buildings, clubhouses of some kind, that are like recovery hubs. Now, quite often they're philosophically neutral. So do they allow 12-step meetings in Yeah, quite often they will do. They'll also allow recovery, Dharma, smart recovery, Al-Anon, whatever, because they are just centres that support recovery. A lot of them will have peer mentoring in some way, so you get kind of one-to-one support from somebody who's been down that road. And generally they'll run a whole range of activities. Some of them run social enterprises like little businesses to get people back into work. Some of them are linked to recovery housing. And some of them just do whatever kind of social positive, you can go there just if you fancy a chat and a cup of coffee, or, they've got bingo on a Thursday evening, a film night, and a five-a-side football team, and just stuff to do surrounded by values and principles of recovery. But they were very, very scattered. So unlike treatment services, there was no nice guidance. Yeah. There was no set of rules about how they should operate. And I don't think we really faced the same level of what are termed rogue operators as there were in America. But nonetheless, there was a real concern, especially among funders of treatment services, about, well, how reliable are they? How do we know that the guy who's set them up aren't going to run off with the money or whatever? So at the start of COVID, we got together 6 or 7 of these organisations, really with 3 aims. Could we start trying to come up with an evidence base that shows they make a difference to people? Could we start trying to track and map what innovations they have? And could we develop quality standards? And one of the things that became apparent pretty quickly was there was a 4th need, which was almost a peer support group for the chief executives of these organisations, because each of them was kind of writing the rules on their own independently, and each of them was having to write the policy about lapse and relapse, and the policy about whatever, health and safety at work, and do you give people your phone number, or do you let people kip on your couch, and all that stuff. So basically, we started that model, and we were very fortunate to get immediate support and endorsement from OHID. And Dr. Ed Day, who's the National Recovery Champion, was part of the movement from the start. And it has grown and it has developed. I mean, not without challenges. And I think sometimes people think this isn't this incredibly well-resourced organisation. Well, it's not. It's like about 7 of us just giving our own time on a Friday morning to try and see what we could do. But nonetheless, it has now finally got OHID funding. And the big aim there is parity of esteem. So I think for all of us, we wanted to get to the point that both a peer worker was regarded as no less or more than a therapist or a drug worker or a psychiatrist, and more importantly, that a Lero was regarded as every bit the same as a treatment provider, as credible, as evidence-based, as resourced. And it's been a losing battle for all the reasons you just talked about, the NICE guidelines for gambling. Same thing. There are vested, protected, both organisations, but also professions. So the addictions field is still basically run by a small group of psychiatrists and psychologists who kind of decide what knowledge is and what knowledge isn't. And this has caused me considerable challenges over the course of my career for challenging some of those assumptions about who's got the right to say they know this stuff. And so CLERO was the College of Lived Experience Recovery Organisations. And I guess looking back, I am surprised that OHID stuck with us through various challenges and battles. And really it seems to me that, it'd be good to get your thoughts on this. A CLERO gambling would be a good thing. And various gambling organisations have flirted at times with CLERO, and we've never really managed to work out a fit that works well for gambling lived experience recovery organisations. But it seems to me it's essential, so that almost to trade unionise the recovery movement, to say we are credible, we have standards, we operate to principles, and it's reasonable enough to fund us.
Yeah, definitely. I think I know Steve Gerlin from Reframe, he's pursuing that line. I've been talking to Dot from Recovery Connections about it, and there's so much, don't know right terminology here, but it just gives you some credibility as well, doesn't it? Like it's not just a name. Yeah, there's something that sits behind it, and I think that's what a lot of people will say. Oh, it's a CLERO, it's a lived experience recovery organisation, and not understand what that actually means. But actually, to have some sort of substance that sits behind it is massively important, especially for your funders, your commissioners, your OHIDs, your NHS England's, all these sort of.
Absolutely. And just to give you another example, I'm on the advisory board of NAR. And NAR is the National Association of Recovery Residences in the United States. So NAR has 40 affiliates, so basically 40 states where they have a localised version. And they not only have standards for recovery residences, they also certify them. So basically it safeguards a family who wants to send their son, daughter, partner, whatever, to a recovery residence, because it has to meet standards that are some of them are old-fashioned things like, are the fire doors working and do they have a medication cupboard? But some of them are about what is the evidence that they provide a meaningful quality intervention that you can reliably say, I am not sending my son or daughter to a crack house that masquerades as a recovery house. So it is an important process, and we're only at the start of that journey, but it is an important process.
Yeah, definitely. So what would be that advantage to the recovery space, the gambling recovery, the gambling harm space, about having some Leros in it?
Yeah, look for me, as we said right at the start, people may stop gambling as a result of treatment. They are much more likely to successfully recover, and that successful recovery means well-being, quality of life, improved relationships, improved functioning. They are much more likely to do that through long-term recovery support, almost certainly driven and directed through peer-based support. And that means there needs to be a space where lived experience recovery organisations can flourish, can be part of a system, and can be respected as having their own unique expertise. In the drug and alcohol field, we still face that challenge of some of the large charities saying, of course we can do that. We'll set up our own equivalent, but it's not the same. Because it really has to be, and the evidence, to the extent that we have evidence, is very, very clear. They have to be autonomous, they have to be peer-led, they have to be peer-directed, and they have to be peer-supported.
Yeah. It's so valuable, aren't they, them 4 areas, I think, especially for people with lived experience. But actually, it's the ability to build rapport, it's the ability to build trust, it's the ability for that hope and inspiration, like we spoke about at the beginning, is actually they can see people are moving on with their lives. And it gives them opportunity as well.
Look, and it's not sophisticated, but typically the trigger and catalyst for an awful lot of recovery is, I want what you've got, so I'll do what you do to have what you have. So it's basic social learning principles. And especially, and that is so much easier if the person is somebody with their own lived experience of the journey. It's much harder to get that credibility if you are a professional, especially. And so often in my recovery histories and stories, an individual will say, use either the phrase of went the extra yard or went the extra mile, and it's about that thing of creating a genuine, trusting human bond that creates the space for the belief that change is possible. And it's that I can't but we can mentality that is so important. And as people grow, that becomes that sense of I have received and now I give. So there is that, you talked about yourself earlier on, that process of my journey is one from being not exclusively a taker, but mainly a taker of guidance, advice, support, observing, to one of giving that. And I guess for nobody does it ever go from 0 to 100%, because there'll always be stuff you need, because ultimately the recovery journey becomes the human journey. It becomes not about drugs and alcohol or gambling. It becomes about all those everyday shifts. And my work is mainly about measuring recovery capital. And we have observed over and over again the pink cloud effect. And I'm sure you know what I'm going to say next, where when people are early in recovery residence, early in drug courts, early in rehab, we get this ludicrous overstatement of how good things are because the chaos has ended. And it's not that people are lying. It doesn't make sense to say that. They are so pleased that it's not what it was 2 months ago. And then the sad realities of life kick in. They're not necessarily at risk of relapsing, but all the things that got them there in the first place, slowly they're becoming apparent again. And living in a house with 9 other men, maybe not the perfect long-term solution to life's problems. And working as a janitor is better than being on the streets, but it's not your career ambition necessarily. So we typically will see. And then, at least for drugs and alcohol, the first 6 months is really around sleep, diet, exercise, primary health care. That doesn't none of them solve those kind of causes and underlying issues and life complexity, not to mention all the chaos and carnage you'll have caused in the course of your addiction career, much of which may well need to be unpicked, including some of the criminal justice stuff and whatever else people have that still kind of hangs over their head, underlying trauma, mental health problems, and so on.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's something we see when we started our organisation, we had kind of an off-the-shelf programme for people to come and try. And after the first year, it was apparent that this wasn't very person-centred. It wasn't meeting the client where they're at. And we very much changed it. And that's when we introduced recovery coaching as the modality of what we were doing. We'd meet the client where they are. And then we'd give them opportunities to engage in different events. And they'd have a one-to-one coach. And, we've now built a community on an app where people can engage. And through that process, the 4 pillars that have come out of our work are connection and relationships, health and well-being, resilience and coping strategies, and self-worth and confidence. And they're the 4 pillars that go through our program now. Because what you see is, when we first started, it was like, can we help somebody write a CV? Can we give them practical tools to move on with their life? But when they're not confident to even apply for a job, there's no point giving them the skill to write a CV because they're not even on that level yet. They don't even see the opportunity for work. They're just not in that place. So we went back to, let's meet these people where they're at. Let's give them the tools and opportunity to create action plans and, create a purposeful meaning in life.
It's interesting you say that. One of the places I work with is called Second Chance Opportunity Organisation. It's based in Albany in New York. And mainly they have a big long street where they own the recovery houses. But if you're going to live in those recovery houses, you have to agree that you're going to work as a cleaner for at least a year. And so you work in teams of 4 with at least one senior recovery person in the team. and you'll go and clean offices. They have a contract with a bit of New York State that they get preferred contracts for doing cleaning. So you have to work as a cleaner. And what fascinated me about that is, if you arrive there as a lawyer or a doctor or an airline pilot, it doesn't matter. You're still going to work as a cleaner for a year. Because in their view, you're not capable in that initial period of taking some of those. And it's an interesting, I'm not sure I agree with it necessarily, but it's a really interesting model that's very much on that. You have to just very slowly build other people's confidence in you and your confidence in yourself. And then we can send you back to legal practice or whatever you decide to do next. And I really like that idea of an individually phased model of personal growth over time.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, so many people in early recovery, the only job they see is a job in recovery. You know, I've got 3 months clean, I've got 6 months clean, I'm going to save the next person. And we talk about all the time about taking people on a journey from being independent or dependent on services to being independent, to then being interdependent, where they can actually give back. And to get people to the interdependent stage, it's not a 6-month journey, it's not a 12-month journey. It generally takes more time than that. But actually, just because somebody's had lived experience, it doesn't necessarily mean they have the skills to do a job in the recovery space. And I think that's sometimes quite hard to get across to people, especially in early recovery.
And I'm sure you know the phrase from people that was really about ex-offenders wanting to work in that. It's called a redemption narrative. In other words, by helping other people, I make up for what I've done myself. And I think there's a very strong narrative to say, we're going to do something else for a year or two. Don't just do that because you think it's the only thing you know and you're capable of doing. And one of the things that I work with an American organisation called Recovery Jobs that's about planning careers for people in recovery. And the argument there is you start with a recovery job, which may well be in like an Amazon warehouse or whatever. Then you think about career, and then you think about vocation. So if you feel that your life passion is giving back, that's maybe 3 or 4 years from now.
Yeah.
You get a job that just pays the bills and clears your debts. You then think about what are you skilled and equipped to do, and only after that do you start thinking, do I still have that vocational urge to give back? I quite like that idea of
definitely.
Now, obviously, it's advice. It's not rules. You can't say to someone, no, you absolutely can't work as a... But I know one of the mistakes that was made terribly in the addiction recovery field for drugs and alcohol was a lot of the big charities employed people far too early in their own journeys, and they fell over many, many times at the first big increase in funding where people 6-9 months into their own journeys were being given jobs as assistant managers of services, and funnily enough it didn't go well.
Yeah, and I get that as well. I think we're still vulnerable at that stage, aren't we? And adding the stress and the extra pressure of working in a charity full stop, uncertainty, commissioning, funding, where's, all that sort of stuff, and then trying to manage your recovery as well can be a bit challenging.
Yep.
Through that journey, for me, I was in recovery 18 months. I then went back to uni, done a therapy degree, came out there, and then joined Epic. So I was like 3 years in my journey before I came here. I'm now coming up 7 years in my journey. And I would say now I have a much clearer understanding of what it looks like, where my place is, if that makes sense, where I add the most value. And it's not about just helping somebody else. So my coach said to me when I first got in this space, it was like, I want to give back. I want to help everybody. I want to save the world. And he was like, but why? Why are you doing that? I was like, because it's the right thing to do. He's like, no, tell us why. And I was like, I don't know. And what we got back to was I do it because actually it keeps me safe, keeps me, on the straight and narrow. I get just as much out of it as somebody else does. And the other thing which I related to the gambling is I get a buzz. I get dopamine hit when somebody else hits a year, somebody else hits 2 years, somebody else hits 5 years. Like that's the new, dopamine release for me. And I don't know if you've come across similar before or seen it, but that is kind of why I love what I do.
And you see it in two different ways. One, you see it in the kind of one-to-one sense of that sense of mutuality. And I think it's a big thing about recovery compared to treatment. Like if I had as somebody who was trained as a psychologist, I sit down with a person and I have a 1 hour session with them. The assumption is I am neither up nor down at the end of it. If there's any problems, I've got clinical supervision for that. In a recovery model, I think it's right to assume the growth has to be mutual, reciprocal, and generative. In other words, we both have to benefit from the interaction, but there also has to be like almost a leakage of that benefit as community capital, that it creates a further sense of well-being. And it's just, for me, a fundamentally different way of seeing how those interactions work. And that it's not a bad thing for it to be to your benefit. I think that's a good thing. If it wasn't, ultimately you end up burnt out.
Yeah.
You know, so many years ago when I worked in Melbourne, we did a worker well-being survey of drug and alcohol workforce in Melbourne, who incidentally have much better conditions than the drug and alcohol workforce here have. And 30% of them had worse psychological health than the average client at intake to treatment services. And you think, this is a catastrophic situation, because how are you in a position to help anyone when your anxiety and depression are pretty much off the scale? You know, so for me, to avoid that burnout, emotional labour type thing, you have to have an honest discussion about reciprocality and mutuality. That, you know, it's like the African concept Ubuntu, that idea of we both have to grow as a part of this process. We both have to grow, and we have to produce things that make not just us better, but the community we're in better.
Yeah, definitely. Like 2 weeks ago, so we've went through a period of growth at Epic over the past probably 6 months, and we've went from a team of 6 to now 15. Some lived experience, some aren't lived experience, and bringing them to, you know, groups of people together was a bit of a journey in itself. And what we decided to do was to put everybody through their recovery coaching training. So we were with David Collins a few weeks ago.
Perfect.
You know, had a couple of days together, and actually it helped the culture of our organisation massively, and it helped us all get on the same page. And now even those who don't do coaching in their role are doing coaching in their job, you know, like as in internally with each other. And for me, that's just been a massive game changer for us. And it's only been a short time, but you can see it already in conversations, in team meetings, and the way that we're showing up to support each other is just different.
I love that idea, and it seems to me like that's much closer to the principle of something like motivational interviewing, where it shouldn't be about set-piece structured 1 hour sessions. It should be a way of relating to people and how you interact. I love the idea that you treat recovery coaching as a fluid, dynamic concept that's not for 45-minute sessions, which I've always thought was a ludicrous idea. So artificial.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's just to help bring the team together as well, because those that aren't on the front line are understanding why people on the front line are doing what they're doing as well. So yeah, it's been a big game changer for us. And, you know, as we move forward, you know, we're just going from strength to strength currently, but obviously there's different challenges lie ahead in commissioning and funding and all of that sort of stuff. Tell us a little bit about what we could learn in the gambling harm space around funding, around the levy potentially that's coming, that you've seen from other places.
The most important thing I would say is from the American field, where they have managed to get a ring fence. 7 to 10% of the overall budget is specifically dedicated to recovery support services. And there are the URCO standards that basically specify what it means to be a recovery service. So it would avoid that situation where large providers of gambling treatment services say, well, we can do that as well, we'll just keep that bit of money. And I think arguing for, I don't know how much Dot talked about this, but arguing for direct relationships with commissioners, not subcontracts with large providers, gives you autonomy and allows you to develop your own organisational goals and directions. I know that in the addiction recovery space for drug and alcohol, one of the massive challenges has been the whole subcontracting arrangement with the big providers who, when things go wrong in their mainstream services, it's the recovery organisations who lose out. So that has been a disastrous model. But the other thing, and I will say this as a researcher, is you have to start being able to evidence what you do. Yeah. And there's now, no matter how much ministers and politicians love hearing the personal stories, first you have to get into I'm more than my story, and don't trot people out just to tell a story of redemption. But secondly, you have to have a combination of the important, passionate, personalised care and the data and the stats that say, this is what we plan to do, this is our mechanisms of impact, and this is the evidence we have that we achieve that, and this is how it's sustainable. So a lot of my work is with recovery residences in 5 US states now. And what we've been able to show is, with recovery gains, unlike treatment gains, you don't get a 6-month attrition. In other words, the gains keep happening up to 1 to 2 years, whereas I'm sure you're aware for acute clinical interventions for drugs and alcohol, you get a very quick reduction in symptomatology, but it doesn't last. Yeah. You get a very gradual attrition beyond, so not back to where people started, but you do get a gradual attrition of benefit beyond the 6-month point. And we don't see that in recovery services. I mean, you've got the same problems, drop out, and if people drop out, then there can be all kinds of complications. But for people who are retained, the benefits are much, much better.
In terms of that measurement, what could it be?
Look, for me, it's really clear that I suspect one of the lessons you need to learn that we did was, if you provide recovery services, don't measure yourself in deficits. In other words, don't use the traditional dependence measures, because acute services will inevitably do better, because that's their job, is managing symptoms. We need to think of capital strength-based quality of life type measures, which will show growth in well-being. The second thing is, don't just think about the individual in front of you as the unit of analysis, because if recovery works, its major impact will be on the sustainability of the family, the primary relationships, getting kids back out of care. We know that where dads go to Alcoholics Anonymous, their sons typically have better milestone attainment, better school attendance, and better educational attainment. Well, that breaks intergenerational transmission. The health economic value of that is just astonishing. So the two things are, don't compare yourself with a clinical service on deficit measures, because they'll do better, because that's their job. They don't do that well, but they do better. But measure this was one of the mistakes that rehabs, and particularly TCs, made for years, is they agreed to be part of studies which use things like the Addiction Severity Index as the measure of outcomes. And funnily enough, a TC is not very good at reducing people's criminality, because generally people have stopped committing crime before they get through the doors of a TC. Not very good at reducing acute psychiatric symptomatology. But what they're very good at is helping to rebuild people's lives and manage those long-term transitions back to stable family functioning. So, so it was restorative justice that the second point really became apparent around, which was like, we do as well as acute criminal justice interventions if you use those old-fashioned or use individual, like atomic measures of, I only measure Richie. But the real benefit of restorative justice is the ripple effect out to your partner, your children, your community, your neighbourhood. That's where so it's like the social impacts they failed to pick up on in traditional measurement. So this is getting really boring about research and stuff. Sorry.
It's not boring. I think that's the bit that we need to learn. I think, so we've just joined the National Gambling Support Network, and when we joined it, traditionally it's been a very clinical offer. And when we joined it as a recovery organisation, they were saying, "Oh, can you do Core 10? Can you do PGSI?" And I was just like, "No, it doesn't measure our success." And also, when people are coming out of a clinical setting, their PGSI scores are much lower. That actually we're not going to really show any improvement on them anyway. Exactly. So it's not actually a true measure of success in recovery setting. But it's nice to hear you say that there's actually, that it's already been explored in other fields. Absolutely. And stuff, that it does need to be different. And
the other big thing for us is, any measure, I'm sure you're aware of this, is the challenge is, will people actually fill them in, So with the RECCAP, which is our recovery capital measure, we have more than 20,000 completions in recovery residences in various US states. But the key thing is, they're either self-completed or completed with a peer supporting it. So there's no professional involvement in this. So the actual administration and management cost of the process is much, much cheaper. And what we do with the RECAP system, which I think makes sense, is to say, as long as people are involved in a recovery support service, they get the RECAP. But once they leave, they can use it for up to 5 years free, and they can access their own scores, so they use it as a self-monitoring checkup, as a way of kind of checking in where they are. Because the other thing about outcome measures in recovery is we're not a clinical service, so it's not like I'm sitting as a psychiatrist going, well, Richie, I don't look so good, I think you need to do that. We need to get you, you own the data, it's your scores, you need to be able to understand it and decide what you're going to do about it. So there's that change in like intellectual ownership as well as the direction of what we're trying to measure.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what we mentioned earlier, is that's giving people autonomy, isn't it? That's raising their self-awareness and then giving them their autonomy or personal responsibility to go and take action on it. And I think that's the big thing, that the big narrative that I would love to see change in this space, is that that's what we do. We empower people to take ownership and move on. I think there's a bit of a narrative that, if you've had a gambling addiction, it's not your fault because the industry's got addictive products and all this other stuff. But you've got to take ownership, haven't you? Absolutely. You've got to take ownership, or you're losing your battle before you even started.
And I think that is such a complicated process, the idea of, at the start of the journey, say, yes, there are reasons, and it may well be that there are genetic factors and all that kind of stuff, but none of that helps you. None of that helps you at all. What are you going to do about it? So, we can get involved in free will determinism debates as much as you like, but you're still going to have to make a choice of what you're going to do next.
Yeah, and my favourite saying is action's the only way, because if they're not actioning something, and I think that in my personal experience, my early recovery, 2 meetings a day, 3 meetings a day, a meeting every day. I think I'd done 120 in my first 90 days because I'm an addict. And it was like, well, I don't know anything else.
Yeah.
So I'm going to do that. But what I ended up finding out after 6 months of doing that was I'm doing that to avoid the work. Yeah. I'm doing that to avoid taking action in other areas. Yeah. And that's where the balance has got to come, isn't it? And for me, encouraging people to take personal responsibility, giving them enough tools so that they can raise their self-awareness around where they need to take action, and then holding their hand a little bit, encouraging them, coaching them into
and it seems
behaviour change.
So much of that is like teaching a child to ride a bike. It's like, well, you're going to scrape your knees occasionally because you're going to fall off occasionally. But as we both take chances with you, you take chances, I maybe give you a bit too much rope too early, and over you go. But get off your arse, get up and get on with it. I think it's got to be part of that, so that everybody has always been really clear. Recovery is not a linear journey. Very, very few people manage to say, right, I'm done, never go back.
Yeah, definitely. It's a big thing. I think it's really important for people to hear that relapse can be part of the journey and is a massive part of the majority of people's journey at some point.
It's a learning, it genuinely is a learning process about what went wrong and how you're going to stop it going wrong next time. And, what do you do? What tools, from your point of view, what else do you need in your toolkit? Who else do you need by your side to stop you falling over next time?
Yeah, I love it. Last thing before we finish, David, what would be the 3 things in your toolbox to manage your recovery or your mental health?
Yeah, look, by far the most important one for me is a network of people who are supportive and care about you, where there's a radius of trust. Second, safety. You have to be in a psychological place where you feel safe, empowered and capable of making that journey. Thirdly, you have to have, it can't be moving away from, you have to have things you're moving towards. So you have to have a sense of purpose, direction and meaning. I've got a PhD student who I mentioned earlier, Kevin, who's just finished his PhD on older drinkers and the problems of onset in older drinkers. And his model is Viktor Frankl's logotherapy, which is a lovely model for this. And it seems to me, at the start of your recovery journey, the meaning is you have to have a reason to get out of your bed at 7 o'clock in the morning, so you're not lying in bed feeling sorry for yourself. And it doesn't matter if what you're doing, you have to do stuff. Within 3 or 4 years, you have to have something that's much more akin to an existential meaning for getting out of bed in the morning. It's not about I need to pay off the debts, or I need to have enough money to whatever. You know, so for me, there's that sense of created some kind of direction. And it happens as well at the group level. So I do a lot now about recovery cities and recovery communities. That sense of, why are we doing this? You have to have an answer. There has to be momentum, but it has to be momentum with a clear set of goals, even if they're only interim goals. So yeah, that would be the three things for me.
Yeah.
Safety, connections, and positive relationships and purpose.
Yeah, I love it. I think the thing that hit me straight away there, and I'll finish with this, is when I was at that 6 month stage going, there's got to be more to my life than this. I got a coach, and one of the first things he said to us was, Richie, if you don't plan for a good day, you'll have a shit day.
Yeah.
You know, if you don't plan for a good recovery, you'll have a shit recovery. If you don't plan for a good life, you'll have a shit life. And I think that was the thing, that was the big, you know, switch that flicked for me at that moment was, okay, now I've got to go and decide where I want to be and what I want to do and who am I.
Yeah.
And that was the journey that I went on, you know, so.
And I love your idea of a toolkit, and I love the idea that you could use 12-step, the local library, your friends, your parents, all as tools in your toolkit. But ultimately, it's you that's got to use the tools.
Yeah, take action. David, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate you calling in.
My pleasure.
Enjoy Middlesbrough.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to the Recovery Toolkit podcast. If you took something positive from it, then why not subscribe? If you or somebody you know has been suffering gambling-related harm, why not head over to our website where you can join our community? The link is in the show notes.